I am highly honored to have a friend and a mentor, Congressman Bob McEwen, formerly of the 6th District of Ohio, current head of the Council for National Policy, and man about town. All I know is that if there's an important event in Washington or around the world and something actually significant is happening, you will find Bob McEwen. You are like the political Where's Waldo. How's that? Does that work for you?
It's great to be with you, Matthew, and I feel the same way because you and I encounter each other around the globe.
All the time.
That's
right. Yeah.
It's an honor to do
It's
so.
like if I run into you, I think, okay, it's all going to be good. Bob and Liz, Bob's amazing wife, Liz,
Yep.
who is the first lady of all kinds of things, is there. So this podcast is a long time in coming, and obviously you and I have a mutual friend in the greatest ambassador ever to Israel,
Mike Huckabee, and as you know, he was not asked to be ambassador. He was told he was going to be, and as he said in speaking to the president, having the president explained how wonderful he would be in that position, which was no doubt, he said, "You mind if I discuss this with my wife?" He said, "Oh, sure, go ahead." And he said, "Well, if you give me a few minutes, I'll get back to you." As he's walking to find Janet, there it is on the screen, on the radio, on the television, that Mike Huckabee is going to be the ambassador to Israel. So, which everyone has rejoiced in. Everybody's been very glad. Regardless of where you stand politically, you're grateful for a man who has the compassion, the lifelong passion, if I may say, in addition to education, as to how he deals with people. He has, just a quick aside, I know this isn't the point of this discussion, but when he was elected lieutenant governor by accident, because it was a special election. The governor had become the president.
When we say by accident.
Well, and the lieutenant governor which had a special election, which meant that everybody in that state that had been Democrat forever could run from cover. That is, the Secretary of State could run and not lose his seat, the Attorney General. And so everybody ran. In the course of it, the 18 Republicans in the state decided they would nominate Mike Huckabee. And with the split up, he then became lieutenant governor. And then, as is often the case in certain states, the governor then went to jail, and he then became the governor. And of the 100 members of the House in Little Rock, he had 11 members on his side, and of the 34 senators, he had 3. And how do you deal in that situation when they're not only opposition party, but every board, every commission, every panel have been Clinton appointees? These were people dedicated to his destruction.
So you're saying he might have had better odds in North Korea.
Exactly.
In the North Korean parliament, he might have had more support. Yeah.
And what he did, he invited everybody down to his office, and the speaker, and he said, "Now, here's how much money we have. What are we going to do?" And he poured coffee and kept them talking. He said, "As long as they're talking to me, they couldn't be holding press conferences." And he just turned that state around until now it's the powerhouse that we recognize today.
I was just thinking about your story of how President Trump selected him, and maybe it's because God wanted him to have the experience of being Jewish, which means that you're chosen and you don't have much of a say in it, right? So
very, very good.
Now he knows.
Michael went to Israel the first time as a teenager, and then he's had a passion of educating other folks by bringing them to Israel as well. Let me just give you a quick aside. Barack Obama mistreated the prime minister of Israel one time, just in a deliberate snub. You wouldn't do this to a neighbor that you couldn't stand. That is, he invited him to the White House. He came to the Oval Office. They shook hands, and he said, "I'll be back in a minute," and left for over an hour and a half, and just left him sitting there in a chair. And went and had dinner and things, and came back. And it was deliberate, just to say, you're not,
just to mess with him.
You're not important. So Mike Huckabee and I were visiting the prime minister a few weeks later, and I started to apologize for the way he'd been treated and he said, "Oh, Bob," he just dismissed it. He wouldn't let me finish. I started to do a little bit again. And he said, No. And so then at the end, as we're leaving and we're shaking hands, and I said again, I just want, on behalf as an American, for the way that you were treated by our president. He said, "Bob," and he just sort of took my shoulder and halfway shoved me out the door. And as Michael and I were walking down the hall, I said about the prime minister of Israel, I said, that guy is more American than Barack Obama. I mean, he understands and gets America and understands what's going on. And so that relationship between Bibi Netanyahu and Michael Huckabee has been around for a long, long time. And for those who believe in coincidence, by coincidence, the President of the United States is there, and Mike Huckabee is the ambassador, and Bibi is back in the chair at Prime Minister's seat, and things that have been predicted for millennia are taking place before our very eyes.
Bob, you're actually you're telling a wonderful story to get to a very important point, okay? Which is that President Trump is in the process of creating a completely new paradigm in the Middle East. And what we're seeing unfold before our eyes today has its roots in the Carter administration. In other words, President Trump is undoing not just the Biden administration, but going all the way back to the Carter administration. Can you've been around since then. And this is very...
I do. I remember it well.
No, and this is very important. I'll tell you why. Because we have a lot of people wandering around social media who have zero foreign policy experience or just life or history experience, spouting off things like that they Googled, like they know about it. And so we should trust the wisdom of people that have experience and have been around and have seen a thing or two. So with that long introduction.
Let me just an overview before we get specific to the Middle East. That is, in order to be a world power, first of all, no nation has ever become the premier nation on earth throughout all recorded history unless it sought that position, knew what it had to do to get there, and what it had to do to stay there. I don't care if it's the Greeks or the Romans or the Spanish or the British.
Or the Yankees.
So we'll take the British, for example, ruled the seas. How do you do that? Well, you control Gibraltar and Suez. Now you control both ends, those little narrow passages. You control the Mediterranean. You control the Straits of Hormuz. You control the Red Sea. You control the Cape of Good Hope. Singapore, the South China Sea, where 60 to 70% of all maritime traffic goes. So you understand these things. And so when America had the Panama Canal, for example, we understood that if we lost control of that would be very damaging to all of our interests. And so today, at both ends of the Panama Canal are Chinese military encampments, and they're building a tunnel underneath in order to check the contents of every one of the ships coming through, as well as an overpass. Now, we can go to Taiwan off the Straits of Formosa in China. So when Jimmy Carter was president, he gave away the Panama Canal. He forced the Americans to leave. He forced a new agreement with China where we wouldn't recognize the independence of free China. And then in the Middle East, where as you know, it was a promise to the children of Israel at the end of World War I on one piece of paper, and it'd be nice for people to Google it, because it would be nice to see how just one little sheet and one little handwritten note of just a matter of a few words. The Balfour Agreement said that at the end of the war that the Jewish people were going to be given their own homeland. And that was expected at the end of World War I. They didn't do it. And then at the end of World War II, it was divided up into a two-state solution. And the two-state solution was to take the Palestinian region, and they divided it into Israel and into Jordan. And you had a two-state solution whereby the Jewish people would be able to go back into their homeland. And so that's basically that it was up until Jimmy Carter. And there was a fringe that we had in there called the Persians. And the Persians had always been allies of ours and friends of stability in the Middle East. In fact, on January 1st, my wife was there by the example, on January 1st of 1978, Jimmy Carter toasted the Shah of Iran as an island of stability in a sea of chaos.
Right. That's right.
Because there were times when we got as low as 8 votes in the United Nations, and Iran always voted with us. America had no better friend than the Iranian people. Quite frankly, to this day, that continues to be the case. The people are very, very
amazing people.
And then the ultimate would be when in the 1973 war, in the Yom Kippur War, as the Jewish people in Israel sat down to prayer, They were attacked on all corners. And as they moved in the first few hours of the war, they wiped out all of the Israeli Air Force. And as the tanks are rolling across
the Egyptian Air Force.
No, the Israeli Air Force.
Okay.
The Israeli Air Force was destroyed in the first few hours of the war.
Correct.
And so the tanks are rolling, and Israel is disappearing as we speak. And you had to have one man at a position of responsibility at that time. His name was Richard Nixon. And Richard Nixon sought to give aid to Israel from the American supplies. Now, that meant from American bases in Italy and in Germany and elsewhere. And this is an interesting little note that people should always just tuck away in the back of their head. And that is that we were denied access to our own supplies on our own bases because it was going to the aid of the Jewish people in Israel. And again, speaking of coincidences, shortly, just a matter of a few months before, the largest airplane in the world, the C-5A, had been delivered to the U.S. Air Force. And as Golda Meir is on the phone with President Nixon, pleading with him, I must have air cover, I need help. And so he began to fly. Now, they wouldn't allow overflights. They wouldn't even allow him to land. And so Richard Nixon made the example. He said, if I give 3 flights or 300 flights, it's all the same. We're going to do everything we can. And so there's articles written called Angels from Heaven, and that is that the C-5A had to refuel in the Azores and would give the Portuguese a handful of weeks in order to deny that they knew about this. But nevertheless, we began to do all of those supplies as rapidly as possible to allow Israel to survive under the direction of Richard Nixon. But she's still pleading, I need air cover. And then he did something that is unprecedented in history. And I was trying to look over the last 24 hours and see if anybody ever made mention to it. I was on the Intelligence Committee where much of these things were discussed, and unfortunately I was able to be advised by the former captains in the military during this time in my visits to Israel, in which they pointed out that the United States, Richard Nixon, asked the Shah of Iran if he would give his Air Force to Israel with no promise of replacement, no remuneration. They were the same F-4s, the same planes that the Israeli Air Force has, so the pilots were trained in them. And he did that. And they flew those planes and be able to turn the war. And it left the Shah of Iran having sealed his fate, having taken all of his assets and placed them on the cards on behalf of the United States, number one, and Israel, and sealed his fate with those radical mullahs. Now, he didn't have to worry about that because America was a friend and kept its word, but we changed presidents. And into that place came Jimmy Carter, who, when he was trying to overthrow the Shah, the Arab world, the entire Arab Muslim world is pleading with him, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. But Jimmy knows more than they do. So he explained.
Can I just pause for a second?
Oh.
I think a lot of people don't know this. You're saying President Carter was trying to overthrow the Shah.
He was, and he did.
Why?
Correct. Well, at first he's explaining to them that he would tell these Muslim leaders, we worship the same God. And they're trying to explain that the Shiite radicals that are trying to overthrow in Iran, which has always been throughout from biblical times, it's always been the stabilizer of the Middle East.
Yes, Cyrus.
Back to Cyrus and the Persians and Daniel. But he wouldn't listen to him. And so he put embargoes or sanctions on all of the businesses in Iran, which destroyed those businesses. So people then began withdrawing personnel. Just give me a quick 90-second aside. One day, a fellow, he had a friend that was an American, and his name was Eddie Segamonians, and he was working for AT&T in Iran during this time. So all the Americans are leaving, all the businesses are closing, because that's essential to have a revolution. You have to collapse the economy, and Jimmy Carter is committed to collapsing the economy. So people are throwing out in the street, and all everybody's leaving. And this fellow, he turned to Eddie. He said, Eddie, he showed him a map of America. He said, this is a place called Ohio. This is a place called Hillsboro, Ohio. And in Hillsboro, Ohio, is a place called the Parker Hotel. He said, my father owns the Parker Hotel in Hillsboro, Ohio. He said, if you can ever make it to America, you make it to Ohio, you make it to Hillsboro, my father will give you a bed, a roof over your head and a bed to sleep in. Eddie sold his car for $3,000, which he kept on his person at all times. And eventually, as the Shah of Iran, I'll come back to that in a minute, as the Shah left, and fortunately, those of us have never experienced what it's like when you see the collapse of an economy.
Right.
People run up and down the streets. They're stealing everything, shooting people at will. There's nobody in control. And what they would get the list of people that they wanted to kill, and they just killed him. So they came looking for him. His mother called him and said, Eddie, they're here looking for you. He bade his mother goodbye. He made it to the airport. There was a flight to New York and a flight to London, a flight to London first. He took the flight to London. It was the last flight out of Iran. He made it to London, he made it to America, made it to Hillsborough, made it to the front pew of our church with the clothes on his back and $3,000 in his pocket. During that, and he now has a family of 4, and he lives. There's a place to escape to called America. But during this time, when the country is collapsing, the president of the United States said, we do not know whether or not the Shah can survive. Now, that's terminology for we will no longer stand with him. In other words, have at him, see what you can do, because we're not going to stand with him. We don't know where he can make it. So with that spurred up all the people, all the chanting, all the ranting, all that. Yeah. And then finally, he said, we think the Shah should step down. In other words, the United States of America, his loyal ally, said, all right, gang, he's yours. And with that, no one would have him. He piloted his own airplane. Only the person with the backbone of Anwar Sadat in Egypt allowed him. He took 2 urns of land from Persia, loaded it on his airplane, and flew then to Egypt. And then they said, well, who's going to rule? And the Carter administration said, well, we think Khomeini might be a saint. And so the United States of America anointed Khomeini to come over there and destroy. And of course, you know what happened. Then the decapitations began as they do.
The hostages.
And all of that took place. So it was a deliberate, intentional effort of the Carter administration. Now, we can talk about Panama and China and the rest of the things, but most of what is going on in the world today is mopping up after one of the most destructive presidents ever in American history, a fellow by the name of Jimmy Carter. Most people don't fully appreciate. For example, when Saddam Hussein went into Kuwait, when Saddam Hussein made a calculation after the Soviet Union had collapsed, and let me make a statement here that everyone should tuck away as well. That is, never in the history of man has a nation had the capacity to overrun another nation, but what it didn't do it. The only time there's been peace is when there's been a balance of power.
Right.
And whenever Putin thinks he can take Crimea and the incompetence in the White House will not do it, he'll do it. Whenever they think they can do it. And so with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Saddam Hussein saw 17% of the world's oil, 17% of the world's oil in Kuwait, which is only an 8-hour occupation. That means I can get up in the morning, and by tonight, I can own an additional 17% of the world's oil,
right.
And there's only one human being on Earth. Only one human being on Earth can stop me. Only one. That's the President of the United States. And he said, I'm going to bet $6 billion to 1 that he's not going to stop me. And so he went in there, and it's by coincidence again, for those who don't believe in divine intervention, the G7 was meeting at Aspen. And on that day when that took place, they're all standing there, and they know there's only one person who can make that decision. That's the President of the United States. And Margaret Thatcher walks over to George H.W. Bush, grabs him by the lapels in front of everyone, grabs him by the lapels, shakes him, and looks him in the eye and said, now, don't you go wobbly on us, George. In other words, made the decision, and George decided that he was going to stand up. He decided to lead a coalition against Kuwait to say, for the principle of right and wrong, nations cannot overrun other nations. Don't think you can get away with this. And everybody, Matt, everybody agreed with him. Everybody. I could go on and explain how the Chinese got on board, how the Russians
I want to pause on that for 1 second, Bob, only because the point you're making is significant for this reason. Because the second Gulf War and because of Afghanistan, because both of those wars went poorly in many senses, you have an overreaction on the right that is opposed to wars. And not all wars are the same. I remember the Gulf War. I was a kid. I remember explicitly, and it was the textbook in how to do it right. Correct?
Well, yeah, I gave the closing argument just before the vote on the floor of the House, and I only mention it because and we'll get off this topic at this point, that the world, Syria, which was anti-American to its core, was part of our coalition. Russia was certainly a part. All the rest, China wanted to hang on the sides. George Bush talked to the Saudis and the others in the Middle East. He said, "Don't call them. Go see them. Go see them. Explain to them that they need to be a part," because Jimmy Carter had given the veto to China. Now, 3 years before, it didn't have one. But they'd given the veto to China, so that meant that the National Security Council, they could veto it. And so they went to him, and he said, and tell him, and they said that if you stand against us, we will never forget that when the Arab world was threatened, that you sided against us. And after they finished the conference, they came out and had a press conference. This was on a Tuesday. And they said that we will not veto. I said they would not veto. They wouldn't say they would support. It said they would not veto.
They abstained. Yeah.
And so then when the vote finally came on Friday in the United Nations, they voted with us. It was unanimous. The entire world was with us except one person. A fellow by the name of Jimmy Carter hand-wrote a note, hand-wrote letters, personal letters, to every member of the National Security Council, to the Chinese, to the Russians, to the British, hand-wrote letters to everyone asking them to please vote against the United States of America. So in the course of this, now we've seen that Iran was now in control, and what it did was they're very sophisticated. They don't show their face. They began to finance Hezbollah, a radical group in Lebanon, and their purpose was to sacrifice their lives, not the Persians' lives. That these Arabs in Egypt, in Lebanon, they would then attack on a daily or regular basis, on a systematic basis, the Israelis from the north. And then in the Gaza Strip, they formed a group called Hamas, and they would fund them. And Hamas would then harass the British and the Israelis, as we know, we've seen. And then down on the end of the peninsula, adjacent to Saudi Arabia, a place called Yemen. And in Yemen, they had 50,000. Now, get this. This is the population of Chillicothe, Ohio. I mean, we're not talking about a large group of people. Right. But these Houthis, they would fund them and give them very sophisticated weapons so that they could fire upon folks and in the process of it threaten Israel and any allies. That's what Iran has done. Now, under Donald Trump says you can't do any of this without money. So what we're going to say is you don't get any money. And the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, they were getting money from the West. And Donald Trump told our Secretary of State, said, you tell those folks, if they don't make peace with Israel within a year, we're going to cut them off. And so he told them, and at the end of the year, now you stop and think about it, Matt. They're not going to make peace with Israel.
Right.
Why would they?
Why?
They're nobodies. They have these private jets and beautiful homes all over the world. They get standing ovations at the United Nations. So they're never. So no matter who they drag along, if they have the Cape David Accords or if they have the Wye River Accords or whatever, they play every president along. But then they're never going to do it. Donald Trump said, "Fine, you don't have to. We're not going to give you a daggone dime again after this unless you." So at the end of the year, he cut their money off. Now they can't fly around and do all their things. And, of course, the professional bedwetters like John Kerry and these other folks, they're screaming about, you can't imagine the Arab street is going to erupt. And John Kerry, he gets so pompous. He said, I've told my friends in Israel, I've told my Israeli friends that if they don't make peace with Palestine, they're never going to have peace. And he acts like he knows anything about anything. But nevertheless, when America cut off their money, after about 3 or 4 months, the Saudis said, if Americans aren't going to pay these troublemakers, why should we do it? So the Saudis cut off their money. And so then about 3 or 4 months later, then the UAE says, well, if the Americans or the Saudis aren't, we're not going to pay them either. And how about the Arab Street? The Arab Street didn't give a whit. That these were absolute puppets for Iran and nobody in
other words, you're saying
cared.
the Arab Street cares what the Arab Street is paid to care about. Can I say that?
Exactly. Yeah. And when Iran, why should they subsidize Iran's troublemakers? And so when they cut it off, so that at the end, I was with President Trump just a matter of a handful of days, 8 or 10 days before he left office in 2021. And we got off on this topic, and he mentioned about Iran. And he closed his eyes. He says, I had them right here. I had them right here. They were bankrupt. They were up to their eyebrows. They were ready to make a deal. They're ready to make peace. with Israel is what he was forcing upon them. And, of course, the election, however that went, we got Biden, and what's the first thing the Democrats did when they took office? They cut checks to the PLO. Within 6 days of those checks clearing in February of 2021, they began shelling Israel once again. And then they began selling millions, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of oil, and primarily to the Chinese. The United States said nothing about it, and so now Iran was very, very wealthy, and again a threat then to the Israelis.
October 7th.
To where we are at this point.
I have a question, Bob, because you hear everything that you're laying out, and you think this is insanity, utter insanity. But I remember John F. Kennedy always said that you want to understand sort of what life looks like in the shoes of your enemy. So when you're looking from the perspective of Jimmy Carter, President Obama, President Biden, who's, was just a legacy of Obama, what do you think they're actually thinking? In other words, do you think Carter actually thought he was going to make a stable and more prosperous Middle East? Did he really believe that? What?
What you've just done.
I can't think of a logical reason. That's why I need your help.
Well, what you need to know, Matt, is that if you are a conservative member of Congress or a political leader, that question comes up after every speech. After every speech, when you ask now, when they did these things, when Biden said that if Putin goes into Ukraine, well, we'll have to see how big a incursion it is, which is saying go ahead and do it. Do they do that? They ask, not as sophisticated as you just asked me, but they always ask you. They say, Congressman, when the Democrats do this, do they do that because they're stupid, or because they hate America? And for the first 20 years, I tried to answer it, but now I don't try because it doesn't make any difference. The fact is, what they do, what the outcome. Anybody who thinks logically, concrete, sequentially, you can see what's going to happen. You empower Iran. You give them hard currency. You give them hundreds of millions of dollars. You know what they're going to do? They're going to have Hezbollah bombing North Israel. They're going to have Hamas storming in from the west, and you're going to have a war of missiles coming in there. And if you allow them to run wild like that, and you say, do they do it because the left, the large Democrat groups that support that because they hate Israel, or because they're just daggone stupid? I can't answer that. I don't know the answer. All I know is the consequences. And the consequences are that when Donald Trump came back in, the first thing he did was start to cut off, and he's only been there for 150 days. So as he starts to do that, people begin, and let me just tell you, when he shows up, people can recognize leadership. There are 4 strengths of leadership of a country. Number 1 is economic.
Yep.
Military, political, the strength of the political system, and leadership. And leadership is just as important as the other 4. And so the second he arrived on the scene, and he went to Notre Dame just 10 days after, 34 heads of state, they were trying to have a church service. 34 heads of state are coming up, shaking his hand, wanting to be seen. They understood America was back. Let me tell you what happened just about 2 months ago. That is that Donald Trump went to the Middle East, and there are all of these people said, oh, wonderful. We don't have these idiots that are empowering Iran that's threatening all of us, a threat to all of us. They want to overthrow Saudis, the Houthis. Let me remind me to say something about the Houthis here in just a second. But as they're all sitting there, he totally rearranges the whole complex. And he says, we're standing with Israel. They understand what Israel has to do. Notice that in the battle between Israel and Iran, you haven't heard one single Arab country condemn Israel. They are.
I had not thought about that.
And why is that? It's because a few weeks ago this was all nailed down, and then they said, "Well, what about Syria?" Syria gives a direct land bridge from Iran into Israel. He said, "Well, all right, let's talk." They've overthrown the substitute puppet from Assad, who was Iranian puppet, and now they've got this new guy who was actually ISIS. This guy was a Muslim radical destructive, and they said, "What are we going to do with him?" Now, Donald Trump? He's not a politician. He's not a pink shirt, striped pants bedwetter from the State Department. He says, "What? Well, why don't you ask him?" And so the Saudis say, all right. And so they invite the guy down there. He's got a suit on. He's going west. They sit there. They sit around a table. All of the Arabs have their arms folded. And Donald Trump says, whose team are you on? Are you with Iran or are you with these guys? Now, that would have taken 18 years of discussions by the State Department.
I know.
And he stood there looking at him, and he said, I'm with these guys. He said, fine. If that's the case, then here's what you do. We'll deal with you economically. We'll protect you. We'll rebuild your country. We'll make it the great country that was again, as long as we understand where you are and where you stand. Okay, so now it's up to God's timing. That is, that he then sends the Iranians in to prick the nose of the Israelis. And everybody understands that they can't put up with that. And Israel responds, and that's where we are today.
Now, this is fascinating, Bob, because I was in Israel at the time when the president was going around the Middle East. And people, look, how do I say this? If you are in an abusive relationship, okay, and somebody, let's say, you're the spouse of somebody who beats you, and you're divorced from that person, you have a new spouse. The new spouse doesn't beat you, but the new spouse does something that looks like what the old spouse does. You're going to get triggered. Oh no, maybe he's not who I thought he was, whatever. And I think that Israel, because of the trauma from Carter and Obama and Biden most specifically, and Kamala Harris, who would have been the worst president on Israel ever. She would have made Jimmy Carter look like Diet Pepsi. But because of that, people in Israel were really concerned. Why isn't he coming here? He's coming all the way to the Middle East, and he's meeting with the Qataris, and who are another whole nother problem. And he's meeting with all these people. And what you're saying is, and this was, I think, Israel's moment of crisis. What's happening is Trump, who we thought he was. And then we see this other crisis, which we're going to get into, some of the conservative podcasters who are doing the same thing. What's wrong with Trump? He's not who we thought he was. And it's what you're saying is Trump is exactly who we've thought he was the entire time. He's doing, it seems like we don't know what he's doing, but if we understand him, he's doing, you said he's working a big plan.
Right.
And am I right?
He met with the G7. He spent as much time as he could stand with them, somewhere between 16 and 18 hours, because they're nothing. They're worthless.
Right.
You can't be relied upon.
Right.
And I was thinking when I was watching that.
Especially Macron. He's my favorite. He's just my favorite. Yeah.
You'd think he was French. He's such a fickle.
Yeah.
So but I was thinking, you know what needs to be done? What needs to be done is the Arab world needs to be united and understand that this is a critical time for them. And that was done 2 months ago. That's already been done. That's been put to bed. Everybody knows what's at risk. Everybody in the Arab world hates Iran's radical leadership. They don't have the capacity to take them on because they've always been the big kahuna. They've ruled. They've been the island of stability in the sea of chaos for 3,000 years. Everybody's turned to them, whether it was the British they oversaw or whenever, and so but they can't do it themselves. And when Israel's doing it, they are very, very on board. And who would get them on board? Who would put this thing together to bed? It would take a strong, strong leader of the strongest nation on earth. And it wouldn't be some guy laying on a beach trying to figure out what day it is. It would have to be, and God graciously blessed us with a nation.
I'm trying to hold it together, Bob, but you're so funny. Okay, keep going.
And so he got him under. He's talked Turkey with him. And in the process, and God ordained it that he has a dynamic leader in Israel at the magical moment. And I think what we're going to see is a mopping up. Now, it's hard to believe it's been 50 years. I remember it all so well.
No, I have so many friends who are Persians. By the way, their food is unbelievable. And I also have a lot of friends who are Persian Jews and incredible people. Very smart.
They really
driven, successful.
They're exceptional food.
I joke with them, they're the Cubans of the Middle East, right? Just very family-oriented. And they talk about how amazing Iran was before the revolution.
Heavenly.
And most specifically, that Jews and Baha'i and Muslims and Christians sometimes lived in the same house, right? Often on the same street. Mm-hmm. Nobody had a problem with anybody. Everything was good. And then you got the Ayatollah coming along and...
I would encourage him, just Google Iran, Google Tehran 1970, and just look what such a gorgeous, beautiful place. It was just heavenly. And of course, that was the longest monarchy in the world. The peacock throne lasted 3,500 years. It lasted from Daniel in the Old Testament up until Jimmy Carter finally flushed it. But Iran, just look at the streets, look at the houses, look at the girls, look at the people, look at the just beautiful folks.
So I think you and I are going to have to strongly disagree with President Trump then. I'll tell you why. Because President Trump says that Biden is the worst president in all of history.
Because he wasn't a follower of history.
But we're going to have to agree that Jimmy Carter takes the cake.
Because he was deliberate.
Because even over Joe Biden.
Yeah.
Right?
Jimmy Carter did what he did on purpose. He took us to 18% inflation, 22% interest rates on purpose. He shut down gas lines. You're too young to remember this. But there was, at this very moment, let's say in the year 2025, by every calculation, the United States has a 100-year plus. That's the most they ever do.
Right.
25 to 50, 50 to 100, 100 plus. We have a 100-plus supply of natural gas. We have more. You can go back and take Jimmy Carter, explain why you had to. He put orders that no one could turn the heat above 65 in the wintertime because we're running out of, quote, natural gas, unquote. He sat around, wear your sweater, ride your bicycle. America's come to an end next Tuesday a week. He did these things deliberately. When he left office, a third of the military was on drugs. A third of the ships could not sail, and a third of the Air Force of our planes could not fly. They had to be cannibalized in order to make it to work. I sat in the hearing with his name escapes me at the moment, Secretary of Defense.
Was that Cyrus? No, that wasn't Vance. He was Secretary of State.
But he was the budget director for Reagan in California, and then he said that he was going to go to a zero tolerance in the military because a third were using drugs. And I remember the Democrats were just screaming, who's going to fly our planes? Who's going to run our hospitals? Who's going to do all these things? And I remember I couldn't understand his calm. He didn't respond. He just sat there with his hands folded and just let him carry on. The fact of the matter is, he wanted those people out. He didn't care. He wanted them gone. Now, why do I say all that? Because America was in a state of decline at all that time in every responsible way. By the end of 2 terms of Ronald Reagan, we had the strongest military in the world.
Yes.
We had no inflation. 3 out of every 4 jobs created on this planet were created in the United States of America. And so the things can be corrected, and that's what I want to encourage people when they see with Biden. Biden was not deliberately destructive. He's just stupid. The question was...
And we know now from Jake Tapper and many other sources that he wasn't really there the last 2 years.
Well, interesting.
We already knew that, but we now know that we knew that.
I'm going to quote
we now
Donald
know
Trump.
that they know that we knew that they knew.
Exactly. But Donald Trump asked the question of Ted Kennedy. He said, who are the smartest people in Congress? And he mentioned 2 or 3 people. And then he said, who's the dumb? He said, I couldn't finish the sentence. He said, who's the dumb? Oh, Joe Biden. Joe Biden. He's the dumbest guy in either the House or the Senate. Now, this is 30 years ago. So when you start, if that's your starting point, you can imagine where we are. So
there's a wonderful clip. Michael Pack, a friend of mine, yours and mine, Michael Pack had a documentary called Created Equal, Clarence Thomas in his own words. And it's from the Clarence Thomas hearings. And Biden gets up and he says, Thomas is here and Biden's chairing the hearing. And he says, now I know what we're talking about and you know what we're talking about. And they cut to Clarence Thomas and he says, I didn't know what the hell he was talking about.
That's exactly right.
So President Trump is now, who has a long view of history. I mean, I know he's very well read all the way back to, he's talked about Andrew Jackson. He is reshaping the Middle East to a pre-1979 model, essentially just saying, make the Middle East great again, a peaceful, prosperous area of the world, and an area of the world that, by the way, can be allied with America instead of China and Russia. Yes? No?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And the 2 greatest threats are Middle East Muslim radicals and China economically and militarily. And what he is doing is basically undoing what Biden did. That is to remove the strength of the Ayatollah radicals in Iran and the Middle East. It brings stability, make those countries great again, because they're a new generation, by the way. These guys are all
wonderful.
They're in their 40s, and they went to a school in America, and they said this idea of mistreating everybody is for the birds. We're going to start building factories and making things and join the first world. What's the other threat? The axis is Russia, China, and Iran. Now, they are not natural friends unless incompetence in the State Department and in the White House force them to be. So Russia has always been antagonistic with China and vice versa. But the incompetence of the Biden administration has forced an alliance there that Donald Trump refuses to continue. That is, they constantly want him to spit on Putin. What does that get us? He wants to have Putin look to the West instead of to China.
Which is what we should have done since the fall of the Soviet Union.
And we were there. We were actually there. They've been forced when we shut down their banking. The only person that could bail them out with gold and energy was China, and vice versa. So China gets its energy from Russia. Russia gets hard currency so they can survive. And we forced them to do that. And there's an interview. If you look actually an interview from just about a year and a half ago, in which Putin he said we had 85% of all of our transactions were in American dollars. Now it's 13%. And he shook his head and he said, I don't know why.
Yeah, this is bad for the dollar.
I don't know why America did that. Well, America didn't do it. These universalist globalists who control the Democrat Party, and anybody wants to say otherwise, just straighten up. You didn't choose your nominee for president. You sit back. It's a group of oligarchs. It's not a group of oligarchs, Matt, that just chose a candidate for president. They took a sitting president of the United States. That is when the kids go to school and they see the pictures all up on the wall. They have a sitting president of the United States. The oligarchs, the left-wing billionaires that control the Democrat Party, and sat down a sitting president of the United States and said, son, you're out of here. Do you understand that? He said, no, you can't do that. We have laws in this country. I got 15 million. He said, no, you don't understand. You're gone. You're done. Not only are you gone, but we're going to put her in your seat. That oligarchy, that crowd, is now diminishing before our very eyes. And America is because of its proper leadership in the White House, they're driving a wedge between China and Russia. I think we're going to see peace in between Russia and Ukraine in the next few months. We've already seen a revamping of the Middle East. And then China, like I say, if you owe the bank $1 million, you're in trouble. If you owe the bank $10 million, the bank's in trouble. So China has made it such that their market is the United States. The United States allowed them to do it. That is, that all of the things that we really need, like chips for our computers, for our airplane. Now, get this. This gets back to your question. Did you do it because you're evil or because you're stupid?
Yeah, I'm still thunderstruck. I hope it's stupidity.
Every F-16, every F-18, every F-35 has computer chips in it that are there because of a U.S. presidential waiver that they could be purchased from the Chinese. Every what do you call the things that at the ports when you lift the drafts or the cranes? Every one of the cranes at our major seaports have built within it chips that are from the Chinese. Yeah. They can follow all the. We've been put in that position. Donald Trump is putting an end to it across the board. We're getting those chips here. We're not buying them from there. We're not going to be dependent upon China. He's isolating China financially and economically. He's making a realliance with Russia, and he's destroying the leftist Jew-hating leaders of Iran. All of this can be the beginning of a golden age for America.
Okay, so let me ask you this, Bob. This is an amazing. I mean, this is Victor Davis Hanson is going to call and say, "I give up." Bob McEwen is the guy. So as we absorb all this history that you're talking about, you see now what the president's doing all this stuff, which, by the way, as you said, is so fast. We can't even. Well, what are we going to see? What kind of Middle East are we going to see? Abraham Accords?
I think so.
What?
Absolutely. When Israel turned the Gaza back to their self-control, And in the first, they had all of these beautiful hothouses where they provide fruits and vegetables and flowers to Europe every day. And the Jewish leaders and owners and manufacturers, they took their employees, explained to them how they could turn it. Here's the invoices, and here's your customers. Here's what you can do. Within 24 hours,
just keep the business going, and you'll do great.
Within 24 hours, they took hammers and went around and broke every single pane in each one of those glass. They said each one of these is a Jewish pane, and so therefore they wiped out those hothouses within a day. So the chaos that's been around there, we've seen a new generation of leadership. The people, Hamas and Hezbollah and Houthis, and remind me, I want to talk about the Houthis, that those people are now diminished because of the leadership of the Israelis. The United States support and the allies of the Arabs I think are going to replace the government in Iran, and we can see a real prospering take place for the first time. I said it a little bit ago, no nation has become a premier nation on earth, but what it didn't seek it, with the single exception of the United States of America after World War II. In April of 1947, a telegram was sent. And just to remind you, the United States was not the world player up until World War II. At the time that we were attacked at Pearl Harbor, we had the 19th largest army in the world. It was smaller than Romania. We weren't a major player. The British had ruled the world for 250 years. But in April of 1947, Clement Attlee, the prime minister, sent a telegram to Harry Truman and said that if the United States did not intervene in the Cyprus crisis, the Cyprus would be lost. And with that, the torch was passed to a nation that didn't ask for it, didn't seek it, and never delighted.
God's humble
but
servant.
Because of the righteousness of their cause, people said, I want to follow them. Now, one of the things about America is that it's always stood strong. When the British, the strongest nation on earth in 1812, was in a fight with Napoleon, and they needed ships and they needed soldiers. What do you do when you're the strongest nation on earth? You go take them. Who's going to stop you? Nobody. And so they go take the ships, and the United States of America, all 7.5 million of them, roared up on their chair and said, no, you're not going to do that to us. And we declared war on Britain in the War of 1812. Now, there again, I don't want to get sidetracked here, but you say, how did we ever win that war? Well, the way that we survived 1812 was that the British came, we had no army. We couldn't defend ourselves. They came marching into Britain, into Washington, and they burned Washington to the ground. There were only 4 stone walls standing. That's the 4 stone walls of the White House, 4 stone walls of the Capitol. Everything else was burned to the ground. They said there's a prohibition. You can't build wooden buildings in D.C. anymore because they didn't want that to ever happen again. But nevertheless, when they did that, because there's no way we could beat them. And then they went up.
Right.
They went up to Fort McHenry, and we did win that that night of the Star Spangled Banner. But then what had happened was that nobody ever did that to a nation. Napoleon never burned churches because that's where all of the birth certificates were.
Right.
Never built buildings because that's where all the family. And when Britain did that, the whole world erupted. The Parliament erupted, and that was in October of 1815. The Parliament erupted, and the King appointed a team to meet with the United States, and they signed an agreement on December 24th, ending the war. So what we thought was the worst thing that ever happened was actually the only thing that saved us. So in the process of the United States then, in 1947, becoming the strongest nation on earth, we have never taken another country, even though we could have taken any country that we wanted.
Right.
The United States has never occupied a country only enough space to bury their dead. But however, as we saw in the War of 1812, no nation has ever attacked America, but what we didn't respond. No nation has ever attacked an American military ship with impunity, ever, until 2021. And the Houthis attacked American Navy 140 times, and the United States never responded. It took $1.5 million, $2.5 million rockets to shoot down $600.
Bob, why?
You go ask anybody who voted for Biden and let them explain it. I didn't do it. But nevertheless.
But there had to be some rationale. I mean, they always say the rationale is appeasement. You
Well, it never happened until the Biden administration. What's the first thing that Donald Trump did? He said, we're not going to sit there and like a pea shooter and shoot him. These bombs coming at us. And when we miss one, we lose a ship. Get the guy shooting it up. And then, of course, he bombed the sites and has put a stop to it in a matter of a week. So it's just a matter. But you and I know people who voted for Joe Biden. You and I people who voted for, and he was of the alliance between he and Kamala. You can flip a coin as to who was the brightest, and yet people voted for those people.
Bob, I prefer to be unburdened by what has been.
And so you can ask them why they did that. It wasn't for the benefit of Israel. I can assure you that. It wasn't for the benefit of America. And yet you'll find people who claim to be supporters of America, who claim to support Israel, and they voted to do that to those two countries. But fortunately, it's all come. And let me conclude with just by saying this, that I was often frustrated as a young man when I would see nasty things happening, like with Jimmy Carter and all, and I couldn't understand why my elders were not more distressed. Why? How can they stand it? He's destroying our country.
Right. How can they not be upset?
What I discovered was that those people had lived through the Depression. Those people had lived through World War II when we won peace and we gave it away, East Germany, and we gave away Poland, and we gave away Czechoslovakia, and we think we fought for it. And you see the frustrations that they've seen over their times. So now when I see this happening and I see Joe Biden, I'm just sitting here pawing the ground because I've already seen it under Jimmy Carter. Jimmy Carter did all the horrible things that Biden did. Biden wasn't nearly as destructive as Jimmy, but so when Jimmy was able to do that, I know that you bring in a Donald Trump, you bring in a Pete Hegseth at defense, you bring in a Chris Wright at energy, you bring a Doug Burgum at Interior, and we can turn this country around overnight. And ladies and gentlemen, we're watching it happen.
Bob McEwen, listen, I've long told you this. You're one of the most interesting people I've ever met. I could listen to you for hours. I'm sure people are loving this podcast, and I'm going to insist you come back. But I want to thank you for what you've done for me, and I'm sure for our audiences. You've taken us out of the moment, and the social media, you called it bedwetting. I'm going to say hyperventilating, right? And you've said, hey, calm down, look at the moment, look at the president that we elected, look what he's doing, and maybe appreciate that we're living in the golden age that he said it's going to be, because really doing this is not hard. It just takes somebody with a little bit of common sense, right?
And I think we've seen a rebirth of it at this present time.
May God grant us an extended common sense era in this country. Yes?
All you have to ask is, ask a person, is a male, is a female, and that person has common sense, and those people you can trust.
Bob, thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you.